This is Keith Lee's. He's not a good guy. In fact, he's pretty much been the cancerous polyp on the anus of humanity for a few decades now, and if that seems like a really harsh thing to say about somebody, then stick around. Keith has been on the run for murder charges for over 300 days now. He's also, unfortunately, my father. Police are alleging that Keith murdered Meaghan ROSE in 1997 on Queensland's Sunshine Coast. There's a $500,000 reward for information leading to his arrest, and if you know you've seen him around based on these pictures, you really should call Crime Stoppers on 1-800-333-000. Was born in the early 1950s. The actual year is kind of in doubt, but it's assumed to be 1952. That makes him about 72 right now. I'm going back pretty far to establish a baseline, just a foundation for the weight of the story. His sisters are split on whether or not he was a normal kid growing up or an absolute shit. My contention is that Keith has always been an evil asshole. He was just better at hiding it when he was younger. There's a component of neurodivergence called masking, and basically it gets us through situations with lots of neurotypicals and allows us to hide those traits that might be undesirable by those around us, and I believe he practiced this growing up. Obviously, the 1950s and 1960s were a very different time, and those traits were likely to just be beaten into a masking state, or he was otherwise horribly treated. I am saying this because it's believed generally in my family that Keith has altered perception syndrome, what used to be called schizophrenia. And that's not without merit. We're certainly not just projecting an illness to explain his actions. The majority of people with alternate perception syndrome lead fulfilling lives and don't match that extremely violent stereotype in the media. Keith does. I don't know much about his first marriage, just that it was unhappy. I have no contact with either Keith's first wife or his first son, as my half-brother, so I'm not going to speak for them or presuppose their opinions and experiences. I can speak reasonably authoritatively about his second marriage, though, and that's because that's where the story begins for me, and I think it's a good place to commence the evaluation of Keith's early years, and the signs that maybe he was more dangerous than many people, including Keith's friends and family, perhaps are willing to realize. Before we do, I know that a lot of this is going to look kind of like an own goal, and I just want to be upfront and say that the best way I know how to explain to you who Keith is to tell you the story from my point of view throughout. I'm going to share a lot of pretty personal details, especially in the first part of this video, and I promise I'm self-aware enough to want to avoid making this all about me. But I am likewise comfortable putting everything I'm about to say into the public record as truth, and it's just testimony that I'll swear to at trial. My focus is on finding Keith and getting justice for Meaghan's family. Even if it means opening myself up to the full force of the internet, I don't care. This is a trigger warning. This essay will contain content relating to domestic violence against partners and children, fraud and general con artistry, manipulation, death threats, coercive control, sexual assault, and murder. Some of my earliest memories are fixated on things that I could hear. As a neurodivergent being myself, I'm autistic and I have ADHD. It should probably come as no surprise that some of my senses are just a little bit heightened, and that's especially true of my hearing. Mum spoke a little over the years over how hard it was when I had night terrors, and they definitely rule my childhood recollection as well. Sometimes they were nightmares, legitimately. Other times, though, I was just woken up with the sound of Mum being hurt. It really was just this automatic thing. From a young age, I've known that something about my father is quite simply evil. These experiences are hers to talk about, not mine. I will only say that he was abusing her in all the ways it's possible to abuse a person short of actually killing them, and that this occurred over the entire 10 years of their relationship. I think I can share some very basic details, though. Their relationship started when Mum was about 18 or 19. I came along when Mum had turned 20. Keith was already well into his 30s when I was born, and if that's setting off alarm bells about age gaps, you're right, and that's going to be important later. My sisters and I got hit a lot. Keith's favourite punishment was making us stand rigidly still, facing a wall and not talking to anybody, just really literally isolating us, whoever it was, and forcing us to exert an enormous physical effort just to please him. It's a hard thing for a child to stand still for an hour, let alone in the same spot, and especially when one or more of those kids are fidgeters of the highest order. It gets worse the longer it goes on, and if one of us talked to the person being punished, there was a good chance he would notice, and then he'd add more time, and it wasn't uncommon for 1 hour to become 2, to become 3. I know this sounds fairly tame by punishment standards, and a lot of people in older generations probably are hearing this and recalling it as a common punishment, but remember, we're establishing a baseline of repeated behavior, and we're specifically keeping this in mind as an isolation tactic. Obviously, there is worse. It should be pretty obvious that I'm queer just from looking at me. I'm pretty clocky. We're not gonna go into my queerness in this video, except to say that if Keith was aware of the true extent of it, I'd have been dead decades ago. And that is not a hyperbolic statement. And especially as I became aware of the important differences between my ideal and what I actually got. It wasn't a phase like he thought, but a real need to address something that was incongruent with my experience. Keith's method of repressing these thoughts was spectacularly cruel, even by casual transphobic standards. While welding one day, he decided he wanted me to know how to do it. I'm pretty scared of welding tools. They're loud and bright, and that sets off an autistic response in me. And I really didn't want to have anything to do with it on that metric alone. But the reason I gave was that I didn't want to learn, because girls don't do that kind of thing. Keith grabbed me by the ear, dragged me over to the bench he was welding at, and then held my head against it. And then the threat came. He would weld my ear to the bench if he heard me express my transness ever again. And yeah, that fucking worked. Of course it did. It's also the moment I realized that my father was legitimately someone to be feared. And you can experience things tangentially and try to stop them with your cries and try to be present and positive in spite of everything. But when something that bad happens directly to you, it really does flip a switch in your brain. The second moment came when we were putting together some newsletters for our church. I said something sarcastic that he didn't like. The actual words I lost to time. Being who he is, he grabbed the big document stapler we were using and stapled my hand right here, exactly where it would hurt most. I still remember the staple sticking out of my flesh before I waved it away. It didn't go through much skin, thankfully, but that's because he pulled this particular punch and he was letting me know about it, and the implicit threat was that it would be worse if I dared to act out again. The third moment, and the one that really solidified the way I approached Keith for the remainder of our familial relationship, came when Mum woke me up one morning to talk. It was the mid-90s, and I was roughly 9 or 10 at this point. Again, these years tend to run together, and it's really the specifics that stand out and that matter. Keith had tried to hurt her, and in a magnificent show of determination and strength, she'd hit him back really quite hard. He wasn't home, he was off somewhere. But Mum was filling me in on a few little details, nothing that would lead to a trauma response. She was also saying that the relationship would not survive. True to her word, that marriage disintegrated, and good thing too. There's a lot of this, some shared here but much left unsaid, that not even members of my extended family are aware of, and that's all part of the deception. Keith tried very hard to project normalcy. And to an extent he succeeded, because he still has his defenders out there. We just do not talk about this much at all as a family, but then that's how we survived. We conformed to the isolation and the violence so perfectly that we never strayed. And we were so pliant that we would say and support anything in the short term to avoid pain going forward. I still reflexively ask, what if none of this is abuse? Knowing damn well that it is, but unconsciously doubting the facts in favor of Keith's ideal. Still, If Keith needed to look good in front of family friends, we would be bright, happy kids so that he would look like a doting father. A plot to scam or cheat an acquaintance in some way would have nothing to do with us except for the fact that we'd be roped in somehow, whether it be salesperson's jobs with vitamin MLMs or security systems or just straight up fraud, completely unable to stop him exploiting us for labor or sob story or complicity. Concerns from family when hard questions were raised about our welfare needed to be rebuffed, and his actions defended, or the topic changed, or justifications found that it's not all bad. None of this is hyperbole. The concerned family member theme is going to come up again and again. His only motivation in being part of your life is to take advantage of you. It doesn't matter if you're giving him a job, if you're going to church alongside him, or in his inner circle, literally blood related. You are worth only what he can take, and he will say anything, hurt anyone, and disregard all repercussions to get his way. And I know deep in my gut that even the lives of his children don't mean anything to him. When their marriage ended and my father had moved on, he tried to force sole custody of my sisters and I, and when that didn't work, he demanded that I stay with him. Mum fought this. Of course she did. She told me a few years ago that it broke her heart that she had to let me go, but that Keith had threatened to kill her, myself, and my sisters, all of us, if he didn't get his way. It was the right call for her to make, and she saved our lives. But she should never have had to make the decision in the first place. And it's illustrative of the lengths he will go to fuck with people, and how remorseless he really is. There are people out there who are simply unaware that they've been had, and who even now refuse to believe that he has committed any crimes at all. Some are under the impression that he holds a sincere religious belief, and that is somehow spiritually atoned. He's really fond of that play. It's possible that there are people out there right now that don't even know him as Keith, or only in disguise. He has conned and controlled people, hurt and killed people, and he is almost certainly out there running the same old long con plays to avoid detection, and he is dangerous enough to back up any threats. Lastly, Keith's work history is kind of all over the place. He had so many jobs that it's honestly hard to remember most of it. At one point, he was hawking vitamins for an MLM, as I mentioned. His job selling security systems basically was a test of his con artist abilities. He managed to break a sales record one month, and I know that in the process, he talked people into more than they needed, because I was there for some of those sales discussions. I was there for the vitamin LMs. I was there when he was a truck driver, when he was a steam cleaner, when he sold ice cream. He was a hunter of game. He also taught firearm safety classes. He had a few rifles himself. In every one of these situations that he got himself into, his need for money was paramount, and he would do whatever it took to squeeze people dry. His ambition to make and spend money took over his life, and it definitely contributed to the crimes that he would later commit. It's important to mention this because in their search for Keith, the police have made a point of appealing to farmers and pickers in case he's found temporary work. Truthfully, he could be taking on any odd job to survive. He's not above stealing either, meaning there's a man on the run who could be using any identity, doing any job, and casing any home he needs in case he needs emergency supplies or weapons, and with all of the skills needed to survive, and the only way he gets found is for people to be aware of the totality of the threat. Now we've established the baseline of Keith Lee's manipulator, abuser, and would-be killer. Meaghan came into our lives at about 22 years old. She was an engaging, radiant, determined young woman, fresh from doing everything that she needed to do to chase her own dreams. She was soon in the brilliant position of owning her own home. She's generally just living life on her own terms. She had a job that she loved, a family that meant everything to her, and the attention of an older man that she was quite taken with. Meaghan had no idea that she was walking into a relationship that would fundamentally change who she was and ultimately led to the loss of her life. Initially, my sisters and I thought Meaghan was pretty chill. And there's a good photo of the four of us at her parents' house, laughing and smiling in the sun. Things changed for the worse, at least for me, once I was forced to live with Keith and Meaghan in the next town over from home, in the Latrobe Valley's Morwell. Looking back, with all the many benefits of hindsight, I can see exactly how things unfolded. Keith deliberately set Meaghan and I against one another. I think it genuinely amused him, but it also gave him cover to be as manipulative as he liked, and simultaneously isolated the both of us while allowing for only one ally for each of us, which was himself. I was distrustful of Meaghan and grew pretty agitated, and it blows my mind how easy it was for Keith to fuck with us. Meaghan couldn't understand, for example, why I didn't enjoy the same foods that she had grown up with, thinking that this would be universal. I couldn't understand why she turned into a little bit of a rage monster at the slightest slight, despite knowing things were happening in their bedroom that might explain it. She was endlessly frustrated that I could never sit still, or that I was sometimes loud. I began to resent her interventions in my daily life and what I perceived, wrongly, to be her part in my parents' relationship breakdown. At the center of every example I could list is Keith, laughing at us in the background as we fought and bickered, and then telling both of us, separately, that he had our backs. Meaghan's big dream, aside from working in disability and being of service, was to start a surfing fashion brand. And subsequently, she was thoroughly convinced that the best place to start that brand would be Queensland, and she had her eye on either the Gold or the Sunshine Coasts. This was convenient enough for Keith because a family friend had recently moved to the Sunshine Coast. I was about 10 when we moved there. For her part, Mum really did want me to go with Keith, but also knew that she had no choice in the matter. Meaghan's family, in the same vein, were raising concerns with Meaghan directly about my father, noting how her entire personality had seemed to change, talking about the undisputed fact that Keith was hitting her, and generally sounding the alarm for her safety. By this point, I am sad to report, the damage was already done. Keith had tied Meaghan's future to him so tightly that she couldn't see a way out, and in any case, there was that dream to chase. And yeah, he definitely set out to use that dream against her. Moving to Queensland solved the dual purpose of keeping Meaghan and her money close while isolating her from her friends and family. From this point on, it's important that you keep financial motivations in mind, because he certainly did, and it goes a long way to explaining why he committed his crimes. Our stay on Queensland's Sunshine Coast started in Bly Bly. We later moved to Marcoola, to an apartment building backing onto the coast's international airport. It was here that our lives turned to absolute shit. Keith had successfully isolated Meaghan from her family and didn't allow her to see her new coastal friends without being around himself. He policed her phone calls. I think she did have a mobile phone of some sort. My memory's blurry there, but Keith was checking phone bills to see who she was calling regardless. She relied on making calls on breaks at work, and in those moments where she could talk safely without Keith around, but that was made more difficult by the fact that Keith worked in the same industry and the same job as she did. Meanwhile, all that work that Keith had done in pitting the two of us against one another had resulted in constant yelling at each other fights between myself and Meaghan, to the point where we openly resented one another. Her for being saddled with a 10-year-old that she didn't understand, me crying foul and arguing that the way that she acted towards me was unfair at times. For obvious reasons, I don't blame her for anything. This was all Keith. Furthermore, Meaghan had started drinking, something that she didn't do previously, but her tolerance was low, and she would only ever have a couple of glasses of wine at maximum, while Keith was just chugging back entire bottles of Wolf Blast Red like he freaking owned the brand. Things came to a pretty heavy conclusion. One day, an argument that I'd had with Meaghan was bad enough that I turned to my father and told him that I either moved back to Victoria with my mum and sisters, or Meaghan left. I recognise this now as the end result of Keith's campaign, and I believe he knew from the outset that fucking with us would lead to something like this. As proof, I can point to one hard fact above all. He had convinced Meaghan to take out a life insurance policy that matured in 13 months if the cause of death was suicide. Meaghan and I had our argument 13 months and 3 days exactly after that policy took effect. And the sole beneficiary? It was Keith Lee's, of course. My little ultimatum was merely the excuse he needed to act, and yeah, I do feel like I bear some responsibility for what happened in the end, and just incredible guilt that I just have to live with. There was an argument between Keith and Meaghan, and then she left, taking her Suzuki Swift and never returning. Keith stayed for a while. It was getting a little late at this point, but when I eventually was told to go to bed, he had his window. He was blissfully unaware that I never did fall asleep. I stayed up late with my Mega Drive and playing Sonic 2 on my little TV, so I know for a fact that Keith left sometime after I had gone to bed. I got up to make sure I wasn't alone in the apartment. No cars outside, nobody in their bedroom, darkness and silence. And something clicked. I knew I had to stay up and make sure that they both came back, and that's what I did. At this point, I became my father's keeper, specifically keeping tabs on him and taking note of his actions. I don't know what triggered this sudden and powerful need. Perhaps it was guilt taking its first steps, perhaps it was all the abuse Mum had gone through, perhaps it was just a 10-year-old being very, very scared. Whatever it was, I stayed up long enough to note that Keith came home very, very late, before midnight. And sneaky enough that I turned off my TV and light when I heard his car and stayed silent with regular breathing to fool him into thinking that I was asleep when he checked on me. I was aware of everything in the apartment that night. When his snoring started, I went outside to check. His car, and only his. A sinking feeling wasn't enough to clue me in to the reason Meaghan wasn't around. Not yet. The next day I was at school, seemingly as normal, but extremely distracted, with ADHD's imagination overdrive, wondering what had happened, imagining all manner of scenarios except the one giant obvious one. But then there was a call. I had to go home early. I remember the bike ride home vividly. I took my time, figuring I had extra, taking the back way where technically people weren't allowed to trespass. And when I got into the apartment, Keith and a friend, Sam, were on the couch. Keith was crying, which was a shocking enough sight. I asked what was wrong, and Meaghan's gone, he said. I'm not proud of my initial reaction. I naively thought that she'd merely left and was relieved and cheered a little. I remember Sam's shock at that. That's understandable. I also remember the break in Keith's crocodile tears. He was grinning, and in the second that I saw that and the follow-up masking, my heart completely broke. I knew that Meaghan was dead and that I'd caused it. Sam's confirmation of what had occurred was hardly necessary in the end. At some point we were at Sam's watching the news about Meaghan's death. Maroochydore Police had wrongly assumed, as she was found at the base of cliffs at Point Cartwright and had alcohol in her blood, that she'd committed suicide, and that was the story the media ran. Time skips again, and my next real memory is my father blackout drunk trying to convince Sam to sleep with him. Time skips again, and I'm back in the valley to stay with my mother while Keith went to the funeral. I remember our conversation clearly. Mum asked what had happened, and I replied simply with something really bad. She didn't need me to clarify. She knew, and so did I. Keith had done it. Before I end this part, I just want to speak a little bit about the police and what they did when Meaghan died. I don't believe they did their due diligence, and they focused on an explanation that essentially was the most obvious and least intensive for them. They'll dispute this, of course they will. They're the police, and they can't admit when they're wrong. But their response was incredibly lackluster and only served to leave Meaghan's family desperate for answers, knowing that they were being fobbed off. They did interview Keith, and they talked to me as well. On the way to the police station, Keith made it clear that if I said anything that cast him in a bad light, that I would pay for it, and the open-ended form that threat took was horrifying. My silence was bought. I tried to make the police nervous, little signals like my eyes moving rapidly, hand gestures that went unnoticed, responses that were purposefully vague, all with the intent to get them to take Keith out of the room so that I could speak directly and clearly. I knew I had to try, and in the back of my mind something was very, very, very wrong, but nothing worked. In my evidence, namely that Keith had left the apartment and come back hours later, went unspoken for a decade and a half. The police should have been aware enough of the evidence gathering process to at least try and cut through some repression. They should also have been good enough to take note of all the other evidence around them. The life insurance policy, her family's own suspicions. Instead, they took the easy solve, and they ignored every attempt Meaghan's family made to get some form of explanation that made sense and that could give them closure. The only concession they made was to pay for a memorial bench at the place where Meaghan died, and even then only years later in an attempt to shut Meaghan's family up. I am working with Queensland Police in earnest and will continue to do so until this whole thing is done, but I can't forgive their errors. It was sloppy police work, and only gave Keith space to hurt more people. I've now established what Keith is like and what happened to Meaghan in 1997, but this isn't the end of Keith's story, and I feel like it's important that we know who we're dealing with. Meaghan's death was absolutely shocking, and it just kicked my ass into gear. I vowed that nobody would be hurt the same way Mum and Meaghan had ever again, and I effectively started my own counter-campaign, observing Keith and intervening when I could. This part will deal with how I managed all that, but it also serves as a warning that even the quietest plans can turn to shit if you let your guard down. For now, what's important is that you know Keith used Meaghan's life insurance policy payout to buy a cafe at a tourist trap in Mooloolaba, and then the rest to buy a mobile home in a caravan park in Maroochydore. We moved in there and I fucking hated it. There was no privacy, and my room was separated by my father's by a wall with a door in it that could be opened whenever he wanted to catch me out. And that wasn't entirely without merit either. I was absolutely sneaking about the place when I could. Keith's behaviour became very chaotic and far more abusive toward me. Left as the only adult able to cook and prepare food, he would only cook what he knew, and what he knew wasn't that good. Sausages and mashed potato every other night, greasy, oily stews on others. While I eat them now, back then I really hated mushrooms, and he would just use them all the time, alongside other things I hated, like capsicum and onion and other neurodivergent, child-unfriendly vegetables. If I didn't eat what was on my plate, then I had to sit there until I had, and if the food got cold or unpalatable, that was my fault. If the time allotted to eating extended too far, I was beaten, sometimes with this giant 50-centimeter metal ruler that he had, and this was just the beginning. I'd been getting increasingly bad at math, as the numbers involved and the methods around them just left my dyscalculia reeling. He wasted a lot of money on a mail-in tutoring program, giving me workbooks and cassette tapes to try and boost my skills. It was a waste of time because it failed. Each time I got something wrong, he would berate me for not understanding what other kids my age could, and if that didn't work, I'd get beaten. If I was caught stealing food to cope with the amount of inedible trash that I was secretly throwing out whenever he wasn't paying attention, I'd get beaten. If I acted out even when I was objectively correct to do so, I'd get beaten. If I performed badly at school, or if I wasn't at a certain place at the right time, or if I took too long getting ready in the morning, you guessed it, I'd get beaten. But then there's the stuff that I got away with that didn't seem to bother him in the slightest. For example, I was always gaming. I had my own PC at that point, my Mega Drive and a Game Boy, and he seemed to think that as long as I was occupied, I wasn't getting into trouble. And that meant I could basically play what I wanted when I wanted, with a lot of freedom to enjoy myself. He also didn't seem to be too bothered about me going outside at every opportunity, so I was always in the swimming pool or down at the beach or fishing at the river, and I never had to say where I was going exactly, just so long as I was home at a certain time. On one occasion, now pretty well assured of my ability to move stealthily about our hovel without disturbing him, I went into his wallet and stole a couple of $100. He didn't notice until my school called asking why I was paying at the tuck shop with a $50 note. And then he came to collect me from school that day. He just talked about how if I needed money, just to ask, and there was no repercussions from that. So I learned that there were things that I could definitely get away with, and with a minimal acceptable risk to myself. I could tolerate the beatings if it meant that I could run circles around him every other time. And again, I don't bring all this up to move the focus onto me. Instead, I want to illustrate that while Keith was definitely a horrible asshole, it was extremely possible for an 11-year-old to work out the line and then stick to those vows within those constraints. It's a very difficult place to be as a child, and looking back, I do shudder at the complete picture of responsibility that I put upon myself, but in the back of my mind, there existed one overriding concern, and that was that people shouldn't be hurt by my father anymore, so I set to work. His first proper girlfriend after Meaghan was another young girl who didn't appreciate the danger that she was in. She was in her mid-20s and she was sleeping with her boss. I'm extremely not proud of what I did to bust them up. One day at the cafe, I let slip to another employee that not only could I hear Keith and his new girlfriend having sex very loudly and with the thin wall between us, but also that the entire mobile home shook as they enjoyed themselves, and she ended up splitting with my father and leaving his employment same day. Next was a woman that was actually much closer to Keith's age than his previous partners. That relationship ended when she was walking me home one day and asked what had really happened to Meaghan. We were close, and I trusted her implicitly not to rat on me, so I trusted her with the truth. I won't name her here, but last I heard she was doing well, and I'm glad. Vows of running interference did not shield me from other horrors, however. So focused on the need to protect other people, I forgot about my own safety, and ended up being horribly abused by the older brother of a friend. I'm not going to go into the detail because that would violate YouTube's terms of service pretty quickly. But if you're going to the darkest place possible, you're right. I know for a fact that Keith is ignorant of what happened under his roof because I never told him, and he never had cause to think that it was happening to begin with, and if I had told him, I would have been dead decades ago. Eventually, though, the pressure of all that just led to my first proper breakdown. I was only 12 at that point. One afternoon, I completely fell apart and asked to please be allowed to return home to Victoria. I'm not sure why he agreed, considering all he'd done to keep me with him. I can only suppose that my state was bad enough that he determined that he didn't have a choice. When the next opportunity came, I was on a plane with my budgerigar Bluey, and when Mum tried to check in on exactly what had happened, I was silent on what I'd been through, saying only that I wanted to come back to live with her and my sisters and how grateful I was. And I still am. By this point, Mum had actively saved my life twice. That I know of, and there's not a day that goes by that I'm not absolutely grateful for her care and awareness, even when she didn't know what was going on. I spent the next couple of years just gathering my strength again. I don't know if there were more people that he hurt in Queensland, but it's very probable. I feel horrible about having left at a critical moment, but of course looking back and being kind to that little boy that I was, genuinely, I think I'd done more than I should have been reasonably expected to. There was that niggle still. And so when he called a couple of years later to say that he was moving to Melbourne and wanted me to live with him again, I just resigned myself to my fate. Keith had managed to find a new girlfriend, and keeping with the anonymization where I can, I won't name her either. She was terrific. She was full of energy and extremely strong-willed, but ultimately very set in her ways and not willing to countenance that Keith was dangerous. That relationship was pretty volatile though, so I just bided my time. I'd had a 13th and 14th birthday at that point, and I was a little wiser, and with the strength regained from being safe with Mum and my stepdad, I knew that I just had to observe and maybe be a little bit manipulative where possible. I knew that acting like that was wrong, obviously, but because I'd seen him do it with so many people at that point, I knew that if I was going to keep my vow, that I had to use all the tools at my disposal, and that meant using his own playbook against him. So with the millennium turned and everything to play for, I waged a secret war. I started by pilfering cigarettes. It was easy to sow discontent simply by taking the occasional smoke whenever the opportunity presented itself. Meanwhile, her parents, who we lived with for a few months, were also constantly asking if Keith was treating his girlfriend okay, once again in keeping with his playbook. Anyway, I really needn't have bothered trying anything more than my little nuisances. The relationship was toxic enough that they ended up splitting. Any thoughts that I might have been acting childishly were fairly quickly absolved a few months later, after we moved in with a man Keith had met at church. His name was Barry. To say that we got along was kind of an understatement. I think Barry appreciated my sense of humor and my willingness to help him about the house whenever something needed doing. And I appreciated his natural instinct to stand up for me with Keith when I couldn't do it myself. Barry had 2 kids with his then estranged wife, and they were his absolute world. So he was just primed and thrilled to have a youthful energy about the house again. We became really good friends, and with total respect for one another. It also helped that Barry could talk to me when his bipolar was in danger of flaring up, and that with him around, Keith never hit me again. But that didn't stop him from one day holding a rifle to my face and threatening to end me. Keith's favourite form of abuse is the kind that leaves no outward sign. And with Keith being Keith, the established peace wasn't going to last. He got himself involved with Barry's wife, which was a source of consternation for Barry, quite obviously. I don't blame his wife here at all. She is just as much a victim of Keith as anybody else, and she was pulled along by the sheer force of his con artistry. It also put me in a really difficult position because I was caught between making sure my friend was doing okay and the need to keep an eye on what was happening with the burgeoning relationship. So I counseled Barry's wife repeatedly, gently, just asking if things were okay and letting her speak to me about things if she wanted. The full extent of what was happening there only became clear when she confided in me a little, and she was absolutely going through it. But by the time she told me, it was too late. Barry already owed Keith money. One night, all the stars aligned for Keith. I was away at a land session with friends from church and would be gone overnight. Barry was going out, and Keith was dropping him off. Nobody's clear on exactly what happened, but by the time the dust had settled, Barry was gone. I was picked up from the land session next morning and was struck immediately by the newly cleaned Land Cruiser. Keith told me only that he'd gotten the car detailed and then said that Barry hadn't come home the previous night and was missing. And honestly, those 2 pieces of information were enough to make my heart sink again. I was so focused on trying to keep women, and specifically Barry's wife, from being harmed by Keith that I completely missed the threat to Barry. Over the next couple of days, an official investigation started as Barry's family reported him missing, which was then taken over pretty quickly by homicide detectives with Victoria Police, though he didn't know that at the time. And eventually the trap was set. Detectives placed a tracking device on the Land Cruiser and managed to keep it secret. They also had footage of Keith using Barry's cards to get money from an ATM. School holidays came around and my sisters came to visit for a week. During that time, I was tasked with my sister to empty the washing machine of clothes, and while we were doing that, a bullet fell out of his jeans. I took it, swore my sister to absolute secrecy, and kept hold of it. Later, another sister was looking for a toy, and I volunteered to check the Land Cruiser. In the glove box, I found Barry's wallet, but I left it there. If Keith suspected that I had a horrible new suspicion about him, none of us would have survived the week, and I knew that to my core, so it had to stay there where it was. Later that same day, Keith caught wind that homicide was onto him thanks to his indiscreet ATM usage, and he called my mum in a panic. Could we kids all go back to the valley, with me returning to live there again, saving us again? Obviously, Mum said yes. That night, I packed everything I owned into the Land Cruiser and finally got to sleep in the small hours. When we got back into Morwell, Mum took Keith aside and had a conversation away from us, but my sisters and I were on edge the entire time. Eventually, he left, and Mum came inside, and she just asked me, "What's going on?" And I just reached into my pocket. Homicide detectives came out to us, and my sister, my mum and I all had to give statements, with mine being pretty lengthy. In my heightened state, running on fumes, not thinking completely clearly, I forgot to mention Barry's wallet had been in the glove box, so they had to come back for another statement a couple of days later, but by this point, didn't matter, Keith was in the wind. GPS tracking showed that Keith had gone to bushland outside Melbourne and then on to the outback. They caught up with him in Broken Hill. His rifles, and he had a few, I remember, were missing. Police never found those. Detectives eventually found Barry's body after they were alerted to it by a parks worker in the same bushland that Keith had stopped at. When we got the call, and this was months after Keith had been arrested and the likelihood of a trial was a foregone conclusion, I just broke down completely. I have no idea how I got through all this, except to say that I had my family around me. Keith saw jail time, though not enough for my liking, We started to heal, Barry's family had their justice, and the world went about its orbit. In the back of my mind, though, was always the thought, well, what about Meaghan? A few years passed, and I graduated high school despite being absolutely fucked with PTSD. I entered my 20s and started to move on with things, and then Channel 7 called. Would I be willing to talk about Meaghan? They had a story ready to go and were after some more details, and given that I was there, I seemed like a good person to talk to. I told them that they were getting a scoop, and then I shared all the things I knew about the night that Meaghan died. There was an interview, you've seen bits of it on screen as I talk, and it became untenable for Queensland Police to maintain the suicide angle. They reopened the investigation, albeit under pressure and unwillingly. I gave them the same information I'd given Channel 7, this time as a proper statement, finally correcting the silence that had been forced on me a decade prior. And then the years passed. Queensland Police wanted to wait until he was out of prison for one murder before being charged for a potential second. And from what I understand, the case essentially languished while they waited. And then Keith got out on parole. Wrongly, in my opinion, and certainly I said as much in my 6-page submission to the parole board. As a small mercy, I'd asked the parole board to locate him somewhere in the west of the state just so that I would be in the way in the first target if he came after me for a bit of revenge. And they followed through with that, putting him in Portland. As a bigger mercy, he never did get the chance to come after us for revenge. And meanwhile, Queensland Police were consolidating their case. Free to talk to Keith whenever they liked after he was released from prison, they nevertheless took their time and did their due diligence this time around. Things came to a head mid-last year. I got a call in the evening asking if I would be willing to still work with them and give another statement. And of course I agreed. I've been saying publicly since I was being interviewed by Channel 7 that Meaghan's family deserve justice, and I absolutely stand by that. I'm determined to see this through. But Keith had other ideas. Queensland Police wanted to talk to Keith while they were down here in Victoria, already talking to me, so while I was giving another statement, they also went to pay him a visit. Pre-warned that the investigation was onto him, he fled in the dead of night and ditched his car, making sure to leave a suicide note. Nobody believes this, by the way, and we actually have excellent reason to believe that he didn't go through with it. This time, it was Victoria Police's turn to fuck up horrendously. And I have questions for them that I'm going to openly ask now. First, if a person is suspected of murder, do you not keep an eye on them? Especially if other police are investigating? This seems to be policing 101. Don't let suspects just straight up leave. Second, what happened at the traffic stop? Because police set up roadblocks, and Keith got through it with a false name. Do police not keep photographs of suspects anymore to cross-reference them with people they encounter while they're setting up a roadblock specifically to catch that person? Keith managed to get to Warren Ponds, where he was filmed on CCTV walking into a Kmart, walking out with a bag of clothes, going into a change room to disguise himself, and then continuing his flight. You're seeing that on your screen right now, and you can see how calmly he is going about his plan. Keith's not a subtle person, he's an idiot, really. Yet somehow he fooled police, basically feeding him the chance to plan things out. And then he managed to get from Warren Ponds to Shepparton. That's a 3-hour journey, using a train to get there. How the fuck was that allowed to happen? The answer is that police slipped up. They didn't see the threat until it was too late, and they paid for it by allowing a murder suspect with an extremely violent history to flee. There's a $500,000 reward out there for information relating to Keith's whereabouts, by the way. And if you have information and you've gotten to this point in the video, you really should be calling Crime Stoppers. I, for one, would like to see Victoria Police take their share of responsibility for Keith's disappearance by contributing more to that reward money. I mean, I'd like to see them publicly acknowledge that they messed up quite badly too, but we all know that's not going to happen. Keith has been on the run for well over 300 days now. Queensland Police believe he might be finding work on farms to get by, perhaps relying on religious communities or prison contacts to hide him away from the spotlight. I believe that the situation is a lot more dire than the police are willing to admit. They never found his rifles, and he could have stashed them anywhere. If he managed to get to his cache, he could be subsisting on game that he shot himself. It's also likely that anyone helping him hide is unaware of the threat that Keith poses, and that they've been manipulated into their assistance. I think it's also incredibly likely that if he is going the bush route, he'd be willing to steal to keep himself fed and healthy, or to steal weapons if he can. That makes Keith an active threat, running free around the country. Privately, I've said this to detectives. They're not unaware of the threat that he poses, and I understand the Australian Federal Police are actively involved in the investigation. But as we come up on a year of his cowardice, it's becoming apparent that we probably won't find him without the general public being informed. To that end, police are using traditional media, primarily the paywalled Courier Mail and the ABC, to try and get the word out. It's not enough, though. Obviously, from an operational perspective, Queensland Police can't make a long video like this one detailing everything that Keith has ever done. They need to be able to focus on the hunt. You've heard me talk a lot about my own experiences with Keith for a couple of reasons. First, I can't speak for anyone else. Second, because you need to know the kind of man Keith is to those who are close to him to understand that he's a threat even if you pass him on the street. He's ruthless, he's calculating, cunning and manipulative all at once. He's capable of atrocious acts of violence, willing to press every point of advantage he gains, an unrepentant and malevolent convicted murderer and serial abuser with a noted history of financial, emotional, and faith-based manipulation tactics. Meaghan's family have been through absolute hell over the last quarter century. They deserve closure on this whole ordeal, and that means getting that day in court, just as Barry's family did. He must face trial and return to prison. That's why this video exists. I know I can't do anything in isolation, but with as many eyeballs out there as possible looking for him, we might have a chance to do something good. If you have information that could lead the police to Keith, please contact Crime Stoppers on 1-800-333-000, but please don't approach him. Whatever you do, he is violent. He will try to manipulate you. He will do anything he can to avoid prison and accountability. If he has weapons, you'll be in immediate danger. Police believe he may be working on farms to get by. I believe he'll be doing whatever it takes. He might presently be sheltering with either a network of prison connections or religious communities, moving from place to place. He may be using a false name, calling himself Keith Harris or otherwise, and he will likely have altered his appearance. He may be missing medication and suffering either withdrawals or symptoms of illness. It's so important that any information go directly to the police on this without a second thought. You could be the person that helps, and that's more likely than you think. It could be anywhere in the country. If you did get this far, thank you for watching and sticking through it. I know the subject material was depressing. If you could spare even the slightest extra bit of energy, it would be really helpful if you shared this video to your networks. Getting the word out through non-traditional media is, I believe, the best tool we have to find Keith, so sharing actually helps a ton. As we close out this video, I just want to take a moment and acknowledge the people around me who are making this all so much easier to deal with by simply being present and warm in my life. I'm incredibly grateful to you all. Once more, any information should go straight to Crime Stoppers, and every single piece of information they get brings us one step closer to finding Keith. So don't wait, call 1-800-333-000.